Welcome everyone to session 3 of Pacific Arts Association Europe General Assembly. And today we've got collections and exhibitions as session 3, and it's part 1 because we had quite a few papers for this section. So we've split it with a comfort break in the middle, and that will be followed by the next session as well. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Stéphanie Leclerc-Caffarel and Gaye Sculthorpe.
Hey. Okay, should I share my screen?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. And you can see this, right?
Yes, it's working properly.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Erna. Thank you all for connecting. I'm delighted to share with you today what will probably remain one of the most powerful experiences of my life as a curator of a Pacific collection. But before I walk you through the research itself and the incredible journey of one extraordinary artifact, I would like to thank a few people. I have to say this really was a team effort, and I feel indebted to all who participated in. I will name a few in the communication, but I have to say I am most grateful to Gaye Sculthorpe, who of course will be speaking right after me. Gaye initiated this research. She contributed to it immensely, and I thank her for trusting us with it. I also cannot thank Frédéric Servin-Rivial enough. Frédéric is in charge of the historical documentation of collections in the Quai Branly, and she has done an incredible job on this research. Thank you, Frédéric. And of course, I'm always amazed at the skills of the wonderful people who work in our conservation lab in Branly and all the experts who work with them. And their knowledge has been invaluable. So now with the story. Well, for me, the story began in April 2019 when Gaye showed me the picture of a note written by Henry Balfour, first curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. And he wrote to Henry Linkroth, author of The Aborigines of Tasmania, published in 1899. And the note mentioned the existence in the Louvre of a kelp basket, exactly like the British Museum one, reproduced in Linkroth's book, plate number 5. At that point, I had virtually no knowledge of kelp water containers from Tasmania, but I knew a little bit about the history of the Oceanic collection in Branly, and it was pretty clear that if the artifact had survived, it could be somewhere in our storage. So I quickly checked the database and did not find anything. But at that time, I also didn't know that several people had already been looking for that container in the past. And in a way, that's a good thing because I think it would have discouraged me. So instead, I reached out to several colleagues and we began exploring the collections from different angles. There are, as you may know, very few identified kelp containers in the world. And in 2019, the British Museum specimen was the only known surviving historical example. So it was our main visual reference. Other comparisons were possible with contemporary artworks available online, including this basket created by Eva Richardson in 2003. While others were browsing the database quite desperately, Frédéric Servin-Rivial looked for the artifact in the early inventories of the Louvre, and she found it there. In the inventory we call Morel-Facio, after the name of the curator who organized it, there was a closed bag from New Holland, so a very vague description, associated with the number 30982072, which became very important later on. The Kelp container also appeared in an earlier inventory called after another curator, Duhamel du Monceau. And that one is especially important because it recorded items that once belonged to la Maison du Roi, the house of the king. There it was, to the bottom, described as a bag made of ficus from New Holland, number 56. I cannot go into details here, but oceanic artifacts were exhibited in the Louvre until the beginning of the 20th century, until the beginning of the 20th century, and they were then distributed into different museums. Long story short, most oceanic artifacts held by these institutions were eventually reunited at the Quai Branly at the beginning of the 21st century. It is by looking at different movement of objects between these museums that we found a bag made of leather said to be from New Zealand. That's the red thing on your screen. Which of course we would never have recognized if it had not been associated with the number 3098, the same number that was given to the bag from New Holland in the Morel Facio inventory. And this is most likely how the artifact lost its identity in the first place. New Holland was somehow transformed into New Zealand, and the material once described as ficus was now considered leather. Building on that description, and because we had found no suitable match in the entire Pacific collection in Branly, we began looking elsewhere. Our first candidate was that item, which our intern, Sarah Sudre, located. Spoiler alert, this was not our kelp container. But that specimen forced us to ask the good questions. It made us consult several experts in order to better understand the material we were looking for, how to recognize it, in the shape it could take, its fragility, and the techniques used to make water containers in Tasmania. And again, as you can see, this really was a team effort, and also obviously in pre-COVID times. While we were examining the artifact I just mentioned, Frédéric kept researching the history of the kelp container of the Louvre, and soon she realized that it was illustrated in the book dedicated to the Denon collection. Dominique Vivant-Denon was the first director of the Louvre, and his private collection is an important source of early Pacific artifacts in France. After Denon's death, the House of the King acquired many artifacts from his collection, including the kelp container described as a bag made of the Potatorum vine given by Mr. de la Billardière. That description is particularly interesting because kelp was once known as Fucus potatorum and is currently called by scientists Durvillea potatorum. And of course, it mentioned a collector. Jacques Houtou de la Billardière was the botanist of the d'Entrecasteaux expedition, which visited Tasmania twice in 1792 and in 1793. In the journals of the expedition, the collecting of at least one kelp container can be attributed to La Billardière, probably in 1792. La Billardière also sent to France several plant samples, including samples of Ficus potatorum from Tasmania, still kept, oh no, I lost my, still kept in the National Museum of Natural History in Paris today. Only then did we realize that the kelp container we were looking for was from the d'Entrecasteaux expedition, and that other people had been looking for it before us, including quite recently the artist and curator Julie Garth, who has written about these items and has curated the exhibition Tayenebe on Aboriginal female fiberwork in Tasmania in 2009. At that point, in the Quai Branly collection, we could identify another representation of the kelp basket on a drawing by Jean Piron, who was the artist of the d'Entrecasteaux expedition, but we were still missing the item itself. And that's until one day, Frédéric spotted another possible match in the collection of African items having lost their original identity, so the X numbers. And it was described as wooden sticks holding folded bark. Of course, the resemblance was striking, but we needed a way to confirm. And that was made possible with the help of Céline Daher, who you saw on the picture with everyone. Using a completely harmless infrared technique, Céline compared both possibly matching artifacts with samples of Durvillea potatorum from La Billardiere's collection provided by the Museum of Natural History. And as you can see on the left graphic here, maybe you cannot and you have to trust me, we had a perfect match. I do not think I can give justice to the emotions we felt that day, but I'm sure that Gaye will explain better. We told Gaye and the communities in Tasmania, and we quickly had high definition photographs taken to do better justice to the beauty and resilience of that artifact, who had been lost for almost 100 years and had reached us almost intact. Quite recently, we also dedicated a web page to the container as a way to share the research behind its identification and to provide a more direct access to it on our website. And this will very soon be available in English too. And now, Gaye, please.
I will try and share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Thank you for the organisers for setting up today's session. And thank you, Stéphanie, for all your hard work and your colleagues on this. It's really hard for me to speak about this because it's so emotional and tied up with my own history, as I do come from Tasmania and my ancestors were Aboriginal people in Tasmania. Just to situate where we are, Tasmania is the island state of Tasmania to the south of the mainland of Australia. And while Cook visited in 1770 and the penal colony of Botany Bay, Sydney was established in 1788, the British didn't colonise Tasmania until 1803. So when the French visited southern Tasmania in the 1790s, it was not yet a British colony. In Tasmania at that time, there are about 9 different Aboriginal nations, each with their own separate language. And the island that you see to the northeast of the map with no colour, during the 1820s and 30s, most Aboriginal people from Tasmania were moved from the mainland onto the islands of Flinders Island and taken away from their country. And Recherche Bay is in the very south of the island in Tasmania. And actually the best image I could find of the site of Recherche Bay was an odd image on the internet by Fred and Bev, who visited there a few years ago. And in their map, you can see where the French established an observatory. They set up a vegetable garden to see how European fruits would grow. They met and sketched with Aboriginal people. And this place of Recherche Bay is now on the National Heritage List and a very significant cultural site in Tasmania. And this is an aerial shot of Recherche Bay. And I grew up not far from here. So as I was growing up, all the places that I knew had many French names. So I walked the La Billardiere Peninsula. I went to primary school at Signet, Port de Signa. I went to Huonville High School and visited Esperance and Recherche. So it was a very, I was surrounded by places with French names. And my grandmother's grandmother was a lady called Fanny Cochrane Smith, and she was the only Tasmanian Aboriginal person to record traditional songs. And here she is in 1903. And these are some of the earliest ethnographic recordings ever done in the world. And in following up her story, I went to the Ling Roth papers, as Stéphanie mentioned, in Manchester, to look for more information about her. And Ling Roth was writing to people in Tasmania trying to find out, could he get her skeleton if she died? Could he get her photograph, and could he get a lock of her hair? And looking at that, I came across a little sketch that Stephanie showed earlier of Alpha. And on the left is a basket that Fanny made, which is now in the museum in Leipzig. And on the right is another basket from Tasmania that was shown at the Great Exhibition in 1851. So these objects from Tasmania, there aren't very many, there are only 38 baskets from Tasmania. And as Stephanie mentioned, until the new discovery in Paris, the British Museum was the only 19th century container known to exist in the world. And so many people have come to the British Museum and looked at this container. And Julie Goff, as Stephanie mentioned, she once said, that terrible longing with that kelp container, that it should be housed in Tasmania. This feeling can't be turned off. I think I see kelp forevermore around this island. I think I'll be just thinking about this kelp container. So it's such a very powerful object for Aboriginal people in Tasmania, just knowing about this one from 1851 in the British Museum. And in terms of all Australian material culture and collections, the spears that James Cook collected at Botany Bay in 1770 are the oldest objects surviving, but after that, it's this kelp container that's the oldest piece of Aboriginal material culture surviving in the world, and there's no other like it in Australia. And the kelp forests grow right around Tasmania, and Aboriginal people could eat parts of the plant, but when you take the kelp out of the water, it's quite pliable. And when you make the container, you shape it and put wet sand in it. And when the sand dries, the kelp keeps its form and it dries as hard as leather. And today, many Aboriginal artists in Tasmania are exploring the use of kelp with new forms of objects. And I just want to say, just finally, about this kelp container in terms of collaboration. When Labiere collected this and other materials on his expedition, on his way back to Europe, France was at war with England, and his collections were confiscated in the Dutch East Indies, and they were sent back to England because the Dutch were an ally of the English. And Joseph Banks had possession of these collections. And because Labiere had spent time in London and knew Banks, it was some years later that Banks said these collections should be sent back to Labiere, even though France was still at war with England. So it was the English respect for the French and the scientific endeavours that these objects got sent back to France. And I think it's sort of nice that looking back on this whole experience of finding this container, is that it was also the British here, through working at the British Museum and doing the research here and working with colleagues in France, that this scientific cooperation between myself as an Aboriginal person from Tasmania and British Museum and British Archives and the French Archives made this rediscovery happened. And like Stephanie, I just can't, when I saw it, I cried. What else can I say? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie and Gaye, for that really positive, hopeful story. And next we will hear from Laetitia Lopes.
Good morning to everyone. I will try to share my screen. Okay, I'm not sure it's working.
Yes, it's working perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I want to thank you for the organizer for organizing this wonderful event, and also for having me, and for all virtualing being here today. I will use this 10-minute slot to present the subject of my ongoing thesis, started in January 2020. My thesis is titled, for now, Connecting the Condominium, a comparative analysis of collections from Vanuatu in the ex-colonial countries of Britain and France. And it's aimed to better understand the entangled history of France, the United Kingdom, and Vanuatu during the second part of the 19th century and the early 20th century. I'm going to do this from the lens of the collection that are nowadays in France and in the United Kingdom. And I want to point out that this title is very much a working title. Okay. So Vanuatu is an archipelago in the Pacific Ocean composed of 83 islands, which you can see here represented on this map. In 1887, France and in the United Kingdom formalized their presence on the archipelago by the establishment of a joint naval commission, which led in 1906 to the establishment of a condominium. The archipelago was at the time known as the New Hebrides. In 1980, with the official independence of the archipelago, New Hebrides became Vanuatu. As my thesis aimed to better understand the entangled history of France, the United Kingdom, and Vanuatu throughout the study of the collections, the following research questions are currently guiding my work. What material was collected by whom and under what circumstances? Were there differences in the collecting motives and practice of French and British collectors? If so, were the difference linked to the occupation of the different collectors, such as administrators or missionaries? What can this collection and their acquisition circumstances tell us about relations between British and French settlers and Vanuatu? And to what extent do Vanuatu people preserve and exhibit currently similar collection? What is the significance of this collection today for museums in metropolitan countries and for Vanuatu? Consequently, as part of my work, I started to inventory Vanuatu collection in France and in the United Kingdom with as base two surveys, one conducted in the United Kingdom in 1979 and a second one done in France by Roger Boulet in 2005. Based on these two general inventories of Pacific collection, I started to contact curators, but also using online resources to build an updated inventory of the collections. This aspect is currently even a more significant part of my work due to the pandemic situation. This first step is to get a good picture of the collection that exists in the two countries. This will allow me to identify which collection are the most interesting to analyze in greater detail, and from which I can obtain interesting quantitative and qualitative data. Consequently, a significant part of the work will consist to produce statistic data and studying archive, but also conduct biographical research and historical contextualization. In this 10 minutes, I will not present a full case study of collection, but just give you an example of the questions that can be raised by comparing quantitative data from the two collections. I choose to introduce, for the short presentation, data from Louis-Joseph Bush collection and Sir Evra Ferdinand Himthorne collection. And to briefly present Louis-Joseph Bush and Himthorne. Louis-Joseph Bush was born in 1878. He started his career as a colonial administrator in the West Indies before being appointed in 1899 as General Secretary of New Caledonia and its dependencies until 1913. At this date, he returned to France and sold a part of his collection to the British Museum. The second part of Louis-Joseph Bush collection of objects from Vanuatu was donated by his wife in 1970. Sir Evra Ferdinand Himthorne, born in 1852, was appointed between 1904 and 1910 as a governor of Fiji and High Commissioner of the West Pacific. His collections were divided between the Free English Museum, the British Museum, the National Museum Liverpool, and the Pitt Rivers Museum. Both Bruges and Hampton had similar responsibilities in the new hybrids at the same period of time. Here is a graph representing the percentage of different types of objects from the two collections. In blue, it is the Bruges collections that is represented, and in orange, it's intern collections. We can see here that certain objects are not represented in one or the other collection, such as masks, notably, and there is also figures that is not represented on the name of effigy that are not represented in Bruges collection. One thing both have in common is a significant number of weapons, or whether the type of weapons are different in the two collections. In the collection, there are a lot of clubs, whilst in Bruges collection, there is mostly arrows. Many questions rise from this observation, such as, is this a difference due to personal interest, or is that due to place visited, or even is that due to different relationship to the two with Vanuatu populations? Interestingly, we can also observe that there is a significant part of Bruges collections composed of body ornament, contrary to Hampton collection. In particular, there are many pig tusks under the name of bracelets here, which are completely absent in Hampton collection. This associated with the presence of other valuable objects for Vanuatu people in Bruges collections, such as mats, shell, necklace, could indicate that Bruges had perhaps a closer relationship to Vanuatu population, which allow him to have access to these valuable objects. This first study of Bruges and Hampton collection raised interesting questions concerning collecting practices. This example showed the interest of a comparative approach to the study of Vanuatu collection, focusing on the collectors themselves. I hope to apply this method to other collections. In fact, I would be very happy if anyone knows of other collector or collection from Vanuatu, and if you are willing to share information concerning collection, you can send me an email to the following address. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Laetitia. I look forward to reading more about your work. And next we'll hear from Melissa Shirez, and ignore the program. I made a mistake and only allowed 5 minutes, so it will be a 10-minute presentation. And we'll make up for that a little bit with Stephen's presentation, which will follow. Okay, thank you very much, Melissa.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, just sorting out my screen sharing. Okay. Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Okay. So hello, good morning from sunny Norwich. I'm going to be talking about the project that I've just started in September. It's an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded collaborative doctoral partnership between the University of East Anglia and National Museum of Scotland. And the title is Imagining the Pacific in Scotland in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Collectors and Collections, Museums and Universities. So in 2013 to 2014, there was a 10-month review of Pacific collections in 4 Scottish partner museums. This project was titled Pacific Collections, Unlocking Their Knowledge and Potential. And this identified that there was around 5,000 Pacific artifacts in National Museum Scotland collections. Of those, there are around 300 and likely more that date to the period in question, so the late 18th to early 19th century. The routes by which these objects arrived in the National Museum Scotland collection are quite complex, reflecting the complex history of the museum itself. So some of these were part of the original collection of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, founded in 1780, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, founded in 1783. The collections contain early voyage material from the second and third voyages of Captain Cook and the voyage of Captain Beechey on the HMS Blossom. There are several objects which can be positively identified as relating to these voyages. For instance, there are objects that are known to have been collected by William Anderson on the second and third Cook voyages. But there are also several objects which likely relate to these voyages, but we don't know whether they do or not. So the late 18th and early 19th century Pacific collections in National Museums Scotland consist of artifacts from the Austral Islands, the Hawaiian Islands, the Marquesas, Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Society Islands, Tonga, Tuamotu and Gambier Islands and Pitcairn. And of these, the majority are from Hawaii, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Society Islands and Tonga. So I'm just going to talk through the aims of the project and the research questions. So firstly, establishing the extent of the collections. So looking at what material at NMS and in other Scottish museums can be attributed to early expeditions and be associated with members of Cook's voyages and other collectors. Revealing the intellectual networks and connections that led to their formation. So through what networks and relationships did these objects arrive in Edinburgh and Scotland, and how were these Scottish networks connected to British and European networks? How can these objects and collections illuminate how the Pacific was imagined during the 18th and 19th centuries, and what shifts occurred during this period as collections by explorers and then later by missionaries were used to tell contrasting stories? And then also, one of the other project aims is demonstrating past and current relevance to a variety of stakeholders. So that will be considering what positive roles these collections can play now in the developing relationships between Scottish museums and museums in countries of origin. So as I say, I've only quite recently started this project, sort of late September, early October, and given the current ongoing COVID-19 crisis, I haven't been able yet to go up to Edinburgh and actually look at any of these objects in person yet. So for the time being, I have been researching from home in Norwich. My intention with the project is to look at the collection region by region, and sort of with each region look at how these collections are changing over time. So I've begun by focusing on Hawaii, and in particular looking at featherwork, because there are some really interesting examples in the NMS collection. This is the largest collection of Hawaiian artefacts in Scotland, and around a third of all the Hawaiian artefacts in the collection are status items. There are 8 objects that are known to be from Cook's third voyage, but there are likely others as well. So these are therefore some of the earliest Hawaiian objects in museum collections. And I've been focusing on featherwork to begin with. So in the collection, there are 2 mahiole, which are these feathered helmets. As you can see from the one in the image here, the feathers are no longer attached to this, but it would previously have had red and yellow feathers. The 2 in the collection are both likely from the 18th century. There are 5 ahu'ula, or feathered capes and cloaks. There's also one which was loaned from the Teesside Antiquarian Society in the 1930s. So 2 of these ahu'ula are both likely to date from the 18th century. And then there is also one which is in the picture here, which was purchased in 1948 from the trustees of the Saffron Walden Museum. And this previously had been presented by King Liholiho, Kamehameha II, to the Honourable Frederick Byng in 1824, when Liholiho made his royal visit to Britain. So during this time period, there are significant changes in the role of featherwork objects. So from those, like these earlier 2 examples, which were presented by Ali'i to voyages in the late 18th century, to those presented internationally by Hawaiian royalty as diplomatic gifts, such as this one here. So the changing role of featherwork objects also reflects the changing historical context in Hawaii in this time period. So as Cynthia Morris mentioned in her presentation yesterday, the arrival of missionaries in 1820 was a factor in the breakdown of the previous role of the alii, the nobility, as intermediaries between the commoners and the gods. So as their role became increasingly secularized, so too did the role of featherwork objects. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And we'll move straight along to Stephen Hooper. Welcome, Stephen.
Right. Thank you, Anna. Let me just share my screen. And let's go to... So that should be full screen, Anna. Is that showing okay?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you first to Wonu, Anna, and Juliet and all the other organizers for managing to do this, which is great. And also, I'd just like to say the last two speakers, obviously our students in our department, to say that it's great that they've cracked on in these very difficult circumstances. You can imagine someone trying to start a PhD under these circumstances. So they and others have been very good, and especially Laetitia, who wants to develop relations with the Vanuatu Cultural Centre, etc. So anyway, so here's an appreciation of all PhD students out there who are having difficulties at the moment. And also, it was great to see the date of December 2019, when Gaye was looking at that object in the Musée de Branly, that she managed to get there before all this chaos descended on us and could see it. So that's great. So what I want to do in about 15 minutes is just to explain about a project that I'm involved in. And it's a little bit of an evangelical project, I suppose, to present clubs, club in inverted commas, as a very, very numerous artifact type that's in almost any museum that has an ethnographic material, but about which very little has been written, and in a sense they are difficult subjects. And there's been no special exhibition about clubs from Oceania, to my knowledge, or there have been very small ones. So I just want to explain about this project a bit, some of our aims, some of the things that we're intending to analyze. And the exhibition, we hope, COVID willing, will open in October in Venice. And then it will transfer next year into the Musée de Branly in Paris. And I'm working with Stéphanie, who will be the sort of local curator there for when it shows in Paris. So that's great. Just to run through a few things here. So why clubs? Well, there are enormous numbers of clubs. Ever since I became interested in any of this, some of you know my grandfather had loads of clubs. Somehow things always been in my world, and they sit there on shelves and hanging on racks in almost every museum. And yet they, in a sense, have been tangential to exhibitions and other focuses on different groups around the Pacific. So in a sense, they're a sort of untapped resource to understanding things about the past of the Pacific, and especially about the skills of sculptors who made these in the first place. What is a club? That's a big question. Whose classifications get used? What categories? And so our aim really of this project is to deconstruct as some of these, savage weapon type tropes, and reconstruct understandings of clubs, especially using indigenous perspectives, paying attention to how they were used, what their values were in local situations before they were collected. These are uncomfortable histories. Warfare, Christianity, colonialism, and so clubs are implicated in all this. And I've just been reading back Anne Salmon's work on early Maori engagements with Europeans. And of course, in her Two Worlds book, the 18th and the 19th century were very different worlds from now. And there was violence in Europe as in the Pacific. But one of the interesting things about clubs is that, of course, they weren't being used all of the time, and they had many other significances. So we can't shy away from the fact that they were intended to be used in violent conflict, but were not always used in that way. Collaborations and voices. It's very nice that Gaye is involved in this and advising and doing the section on Australian Aboriginal clubs, and Emmanuel Casario is the now president of the Musée de Branly, is dealing with his own area, New Caledonia, Kanaki, and Kirk Huffman is helping us out with Vanuatu and Philippe Peltier, and so there are other people involved. Of course, this project, as every other, has been blighted in a way by COVID. It wasn't even sure it was going to go ahead until late last year. But so it's the range of things we would like to do and collaborations and things like this has been highly restricted. But we do hope that in 2022, when the exhibition shows in Paris, that things will be much easier then, and we can hold a conference and get people from the Pacific and really push on. Lenders have been brilliant: British Museum, National Museum Scotland, Dutch National Museums, Wonu and Gaye and all that, and Cambridge, Anita and Nick Thomas, Musée de Branly, of course. So everyone has been optimistic about the fact that we can push on and achieve this exhibition. And we hope that there will be legacies in the book that's being prepared, and indeed, certainly we hope when it's on in Paris, there can be conferences and stimulation of interest in, sorry, moving too quickly here, within Oceania and amongst Pacific colleagues, some of whom are interested, but I think many other Pacific colleagues are dealing with other aspects of their collections. So what is a club? Briefly, themes explored. What we want to do in the exhibition and in the publication is look at, if you like, to recategorize according to certain more detached classifications. And one is sculpture. The fact is, somebody made these. And I'll show you pictures in a minute of them. And they were made by someone, often with tremendous care and finely finished. Anyone who knows about oceanic clubs knows that some of them are extraordinarily finely finished and polished and great care taken over them. So they go way beyond any requirement to have a stick to hit someone with effectively. Something more is going on there. And that's a fundamental question in the project is, if you just wanted an effective stick to hit someone with, why on earth would you go to all this trouble to make these quite remarkable artifact sculptures? Another aspect is exchange valuables. They were clearly exchange valuables. The maker was not always or usually the user. There were specialist carpenters who were also canoe builders and house builders, and they would be commissioned or they would be making them, and then they would be distributed in the local area. Sometimes they were acquired as war booty. And many were exchanged, bartered, or sold to Europeans, as we know. And that's how, obviously, they ended up in collections here. And obviously, they're extremely robust, so they tend not to deteriorate like objects of featherwork, etc. And it's brilliant that that kelp container has survived 230 years or whatever. They were indeed weapons, many, but by no means all were used in combat. And we've stretched the classification, if you like, of clubs in this exhibition to include things previously classified as dance clubs and things of that kind. They were clearly markers of authority and status. A Mere Ponamu, a Nephrite Maori hand club, was clearly associated with very high status in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then they were elaborated and or inlaid with things like sperm whale ivory or shell in the Solomon Islands, which are signifying special qualities and characters of those people who owned them or were custodians of them. They were indeed embodiments of divinity, and there's evidence for this where they are given deomorphic or anthropomorphic features often, and they are clearly connected to they, in a sense, could be regarded as God images, if I can put it in that rather crude term. And that, of course, any success that you might have, whether it's in gardening or fishing or indeed war, is going to be dependent on the state of your relationship with your ancestors, your gods, or your spirits. And that still obtains today just about all around the world. They were performance accessories and costume aspects. They were worn, if I can put it that way, and highly elaborated, often with feathers and bindings and things of that kind. Sadly, many of those obviously have gone through time. And now in the modern world, they are aspects of heritage. they are regarded as works of art, or indeed, from evangelicals, they may be regarded as works of the devil. So there are many different perspectives on the status of these remarkable things. Just going to mention a few aspects that we are looking at and want to present in the exhibition, where we want to present them as, if you like, sculptures, that these are extremely finely made things. And for a European audience, you know, one can ask the question, well, if you're really highly value Brancusi or Giacometti or these artists of the 20th century, why don't you look at these things with a fresh light? The people who made these had extraordinary sculptural skills and conceiving of forms. So it's not, in a sense, to do some rather crude comparison with European modern art, but to say to the audience, don't just think of these things as somehow savage weapons. Look at them as rather remarkable cultural creations. And one thing we want to look at is how it's a slightly old-fashioned in a way. It goes back to Rangiroa and Skinner and people like this doing comparisons of form across the Pacific. But I think there are things to be gained by this about elaborating relationships. So we have here these 4 clubs here, two from Rapa Nui, one from Marquesas, one from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where the idea of the bifacial head is revealed in different ways. And interestingly, in the case of the Aotearoa New Zealand example, the head is turned, if you like, so that it's facing towards the point rather than facing out, but there are faces on both sides. And this actually shows the very rather high-speed creativity and adaptability of Polynesian, in this case, sculptures, to take a fundamental idea that's important cosmologically, probably, to have this protective bifacial form, and then adapt it locally and culturally to produce these very distinctive forms. One's looking at, when you look at clubs, you see things where symmetry seems to be prevailing and where asymmetry seems to prevail. And why this might be, whether it's a purely functional thing in terms of the ergonomics of swinging a weapon, or whether other things are going on, which of course they are. So here's just 4 clubs which are, in a sense, very specifically not intended to have symmetry, unless you look at them, I suppose, from the thin end. But it also shows the remarkable variety of forms which were achieved by Pacific sculptors. Then we can look at symmetry again across the Pacific. We're covering the whole Pacific. It's a ridiculously ambitious project, really, but we hope that it'll lay a sort of platform for people in different areas, and especially Pacific Islanders, to start to look more at their own collections and their own particular cultural histories. So here we have just a selection of symmetrical forms from different parts of the Pacific, where again they are extraordinary sculptures. I apologize for the one second from the right, which is actually on a rack in the British Museum, but it is a most remarkable sculpture in terms of how it's been formed and the fineness of its execution. And it had this reddish sort of ochre patination. It doesn't really show in the photograph very well. Sorry, Gaye, if I'm breaking the rules by showing the inside of British Museum storage, but anyway, that's the best photo I had. And another thing is to show how one can do some more fine-grained analysis, perhaps, and identify workshops or even hands. And in fact, it was a PAA visit to Linden Museum that really organized for us, where I saw this Patuparawa in the middle there, and it struck me it was very similar to one on the right, which is going to be in the exhibition, and indeed quite similar to one on the left, which is in Te Papa. And both the one on the left and the one in the Linden Museum are associated with particular named Maoris of the early to middle of the 19th century. And one can see here that they're probably not all made by the same hand, but there is a very similar overall form, and the proportions of the lower part and the indentations and the neck, and it's reasonably flat, and the positioning of the whole. But the treatment of the head at the top, which is a humanoid head, sometimes they're referred to as birds' heads, but the nostril makes that unlikely. But where you have this very interesting form of a sort of circular mouth with a tongue emerging, and then this line coming from the eyeball going back onto the top of the head to a sort of lump, a central lump on the brow. Now, what all this meant or means, that's another matter that I'm not capable of deciphering, but it seems to me that one can also, in a sense, doing a service to the original people who made these, generate some art historical studies of particular workshops and indeed hands responsible for these remarkable pieces. In a sense, we're looking at historical collections, 18th and 19th century mostly, but it's also one wants to refer to the enduring significance of clubs. And here's just two quick pictures I put in. One that I took myself in May 1980 at a very large scale ceremonial occasion in Fiji, the bringing of the children of one chieftain to the others with massive presentations of canoes and piles of yams. And there were attendant guards and warriors, in a sense, keeping order, and during the important parts of the ceremonial presentations and presentation rituals, these guys were the only ones standing up, and anyone else standing up, I was told, would have had a whack with the club. In a sense, they're policemen there to keep order. And on the right, Kirk Huffman has sent me this photograph. And if you look here, this friend of his, I don't have his name, unfortunately, on Ambrim. He is holding one of these Vanuatu clubs, which have this thick sling. In Cambridge, in the museum there's a beautiful Cook Voyage one without a slightly different head. But you see, the club is hanging beneath his right hand. It's one of those with the four projecting spheres, but it shows how, and as Kirk put it, this club is worn. It's a costume element. It's part of that person's persona. And just briefly, the exhibition, which we hope will open on the 15th of October in Venice, it's in one of these special exhibition places that's used for the Biennale and other exhibitions, the Palazzo Franchetti. But it does present difficulties. I mean, it's an amazing place, as you can see, but it's not a classic exhibition venue for the sort of things we want to show. It's an old palazzo with these high ceilings, massive chandeliers that we can't move. And so we've tried to develop some interesting ways of getting around that. And there's some early sketches of how the exhibition themes might be developed in those spaces. So that's just my presentation there, that we hope that this will be a sort of platform for further research and study. Within the project, there is obviously mini research going on in certain ways, but we hope that it will, in a sense, allow people to see with fresh eyes these collections, and different people in different museums will also be able to see their own collections with fresh eyes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Before we go to questions and answers, I should have drawn your attention to the General Assembly link where you can register for that. That will be this afternoon, and that's in the chat, probably the first thing that's in there. So I'll read the questions and pass them on to the presenters, and I think we've already got some here. So a question to Laetitia Lopes. To what extent have Bouger and Intern collected locally, and to what extent were objects passed on to them by local government residents, for example, Morton King, the British resident commissioner?
Thank you very much for this really interesting question. I cannot answer really to this question yet because I need to go through the archives actually. I do know that Bouge had correspondences with the British Museum, and in it, when he sold his collection, he mentioned that it was a part of his collection was from his friends. So I don't know to what extent is that true or not, but there is this little hint here. And I also know that in Chartres Museum, there is a huge archives from Bouge, actually. So I need to go through that before saying for Bouge anything more about his relationship and how he acquired the objects. And for Intern's collection, I don't have yet information about that. he have skulls from Malikolo, and I read somewhere that they had a huge selling of this kind of skulls. So perhaps it wasn't something that he collected, but he bought when he was there. He bought when he was there. So, but it's ongoing.
Ongoing research. Yeah. Thank you very much. There's a question from Oliver Loeb to Stephen. How do you include questions of identities, belonging, and gender? What do you think about including clubs from Santa Cruz Archipelago?
Yes, thanks, Oliver. First, for Santa Cruz, one problem with this, of course, is that we, in some ways, could include 500 clubs in the exhibition in the book, and that's not possible. Venice exhibition, there will be 128, and in Branly, there will be a few more. But we are including one of these Santa Cruz so-called dance clubs, the painted ones with fiber attachments. And we are trying to include clubs from as many areas across the Pacific as possible, in a sense to show the variety. So Santa Cruz is included under the general Solomon Islands banner. In terms of identities and belonging and gender, there tends obviously to be a very strong male and masculine aspect to all of this, although by no means exclusively so. And so that will be dealt with in the exhibition. And identities are, I'm not quite sure what you mean there, whether to what extent New Zealand Maori will identify with particular clubs that were made there, or whether there are personal identities with clubs, which there clearly were in Fiji, where particular clubs that had actually been involved in conflict or involved in slaying would have names, and so that clubs, in a sense, took on particular identities. And one example there is the current mace in the Fiji Parliament is a club that belonged to Vakumbau, who was the most powerful chief in Fiji in the middle of the 19th century. And it's the club that when Fiji joined the British Empire in 1874 was sent to Queen Victoria. And Vakumbau had already had it elaborated and mounted with silver leaves and things of this kind. That was sent back in 1932 to Fiji to be the mace of the Legislative Assembly, and now it's the mace in the Fiji Parliament. And it embodies, and in fact, the great-great-great-grandson of Vakumbau is the Speaker in the Fiji Parliament. And we're hoping to have a video discussion with him about the importance of this artifact historically in Fiji. So I don't know whether that answers your question entirely clearly, but there are individual identities and there are more general identities. The other thing about the clubs is that it's very variable. Some places had very few clubs, and it seems that in conflict, bows and arrows prevailed, or spears. In Tahiti, for instance, in the 18th century, very few clubs, only one type. Other places like New Zealand, enormous variety of types.
Perhaps I could ask you a bit more about the gender situation with the exhibition, because of course it's a highly male object in general. Are there any opportunities to put female perspectives or female historical connections in there?
There are. I mean, I think it's clear that, say, in New Zealand, obviously it's very difficult to cover every aspect of the Pacific, or every part of the Pacific, in terms of all the different relevant aspects. But say in New Zealand, it's clear that women were in a sense involved in fighting, and that it's not an exclusively male area, although in some areas of the Pacific clearly was. There are some things which we want to debunk, like certain Fijian clubs were used by husbands to beat their wives with, as if somehow that was the origin of that form. Those sorts of things that keep being repeated, we want to question. And there is, Gaye is doing the Australian section for us, and there are clubs associated with women in Australia, we used in Australia. Mm-hmm. But clearly one can't shy away from the fact that this is not an exhibition about say, basket work, which was exclusively, let's say, a female practice largely, or let's say bark cloth in the Pacific, for instance. So one just has to face the fact that this is, but I hope people don't just see it as a sort of boys thing, because these are important cultural products that people took a lot of time and trouble over.
Yep, thank you. A question for Steve from Lisa McDonald. Will there be any clubs made by contemporary makers, artists, or contemporary artists included in the exhibition?
There won't be in Venice because we absolutely are pushed for space. It's a very small exhibition space. And so we will deal photographically with more recent things. But in Paris, we're still discussing with Stéphanie whether there is a danger here, and I'm going to be quite out there about it, that sometimes if you put contemporary, it's a different depends what you mean. In Fiji, they're making like space agey type stuff, you know, which one of them was given to Prince Harry by the president when he visited 2 years ago. And I don't know whether they're even made by ethnic Fijians, but they are sort of zoomy type things, you know, video game type clubs, which are made. But if you put them, and you can buy them in shops in downtown Suva, but if you put them next to old ones, they really wilt in comparison. So one has to be quite careful. I think the idea of involving contemporary artists is in terms of interpretations, what clubs might mean or affect them in their work and that sort of thing. So I think in Paris, because we have a much bigger space and much longer to plan, we're planning to do more engagement with contemporary artists in that way. I also saw someone there ask a question about why is an ao and taiaha classified as a club? Right, well, taiaha certainly were used to hit people with. And even though I think H.D. Skinner said a thing wasn't a club unless you hit downwards with it, which seems a rather restricted classification, I don't think anyone would argue that taiaha were not used to hit people with. And there's a brilliant video made 3 or 4 years ago about an occasion in New Zealand 3 or 4 years ago when there was a fight, when there was a wero and it all went wrong. The issue of the ao, it relates to the sort of the dance staff dance club, where things that might originally have had a club-like form then become adapted and are no longer used in combat, but in a sense are part of a broader class of objects which are manipulated and are important. So that's why an ao, which is also an authority staff, and the ua also, which also was a weapon. So we are, I mean, we'll just have to put up with people who think that certain things are not clubs. But the point is that club is an unsatisfactory definition, and that we want to broaden it out to staffs and things of this kind, which have a club form but may not have been used in actual combat.
Well, perhaps you can see the next comment as well from Stephanie
Right.
Zakat. And I think maybe you've already covered this. So I love clubs. Thank you for organizing this. There is a common assumption that collecting armors is an old man's hobby, whereas women collect textiles, basketry and jewelry, etc. It will be interesting to see whether the research might challenge this gender-biased postulate, or perhaps exhibition visitors analytics will illuminate this.
Yes, it'll be interesting to see, and we might, I think the exhibition in Venice might well teach us some lessons and give us some pointers as to how to adapt when it's on in Paris. That yes, there is a sense that this is a sort of boys thing, and certainly from a European perspective, and we want to, in a sense, challenge that. But the fact is that most of these clubs were made by men and were used by men. And so we're going to sort of try and see, but we certainly want to try to, as part of the deconstruction thing, is to sort of strip away lots of assumptions, basically, that people might make about them.
Great, thank you. Wonu, you appeared. Did you have a question? No? Okay. So we'll move on to Anita Hurl's question. Thanks to all the speakers. My question is for Gaye and Stéphanie. Your joint paper revealed remarkable collaborative detective work over a long time that went into identifying the Tasmanian kelp basket. Can you say a bit more about the technical or scientific analysis that was involved in the identification?
Stephanie, on that.
Okay, so I'm not the scientist who did so I'm going to do my best to speak about this. I just Googled it actually. So the name in English, in French, it's called spectrométrie infrarouge à transformer de Fourier. And in English, apparently it's transform infrared spectroscopy. So the idea, if I understood properly, well, at first it's very good because it allows us to be, it's a very non-invasive analysis method. We actually don't even need to touch the artifact. On the picture I showed you, there's no contact between the machine and the object, so it's very safe. The idea is that you send infrared light to the object, and it's going to send you back a signal which has a specific signature and allows you to understand the composition of the material and the molecules that make it up. And that's apparently very precise, and it allows us to see a lot of different things. The luck we had is that, of course, we had some very good samples for comparisons, because we had the samples that were Durvidea potatorum, so the same kelp algae, collected by La Billardière in 1792. So by comparing these very specific samples with the signature, the infrared signature of those very specific samples with the artifact, and obtaining what I have been told is a perfect match. We have something that's very rare in museum work. We have almost 100% degree of certitude about the identification of the artifact. I hope that answers the question and that I did not say stupid things about the...
Could I just make one quick comment?
Sure.
And that is, for me, the general lesson about researching this object is for everyone who has objects in their collection that may be unprovenance, that may be called a duplicate, and might have a Q number, you're not sure where it's from, that this and other examples I've come across means that some of the objects with the least or no documentation can be the most important object in the collection. So give them good attention.
Congratulations to both of you for doubling the number of historical kelp baskets in the world that are available to descendants and everyone else to enjoy. Now we also have a question from Franklin Bong to Laetitia Lopes. As a Ni Vanuatuan, I would like to acknowledge the great initiative and work you have done so far. I would like to know if this unique way of comparation will also include other European countries, not only France and England museums.
It would be fantastic, but for the PhD, I would not be able to do so. But the idea is to investigate this kind of approach of the collection and to see if we can have something interesting from this kind of methods. But yeah, it would be interesting to compare. I know that there is collection in the USA. There is a lot of Ni Vanuatu collection in Canada as well, and due to the history, and in Australia as well. So yeah, it's not for this work.
For the future.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, perhaps I can put a question in too. So far you've done the assemblage analysis. Has that turned up any particular categories that might be considered as indicating a connection to women, like the women gave these objects up, or was it primarily male so far? Just to continue the gender question.
About gender, I don't have yet that much information related to this particular aspect. But interestingly, I try to figure it out, the involvement of Madame Bush in the Bush collection as well, because she kept the collection for a long period of time after her husband died. And so I try to see her relationship to the collection as well, but I need to go through the archive and I couldn't yet.
Yep, thank you. Any further questions?
Or perhaps I can put a question in. I have a question for, or it's not really a question, it's a comment really, and congratulations to Gaye and Stéphanie, because as you probably know, when we were preparing the D'Entrecasteaux book, we really kind of desperately searched to find the kelp basket. And we gave up basically, and but we didn't give up completely. And by way of kind of featuring the basket, we chose the image that Stéphanie also showed, made by La Biardière, and we really put the basket in a central position on the cover of the book to have this kind of basket presence. And also Julie Goff also contributed with a piece of work. So it's really exciting to see, you know, that the basket has been found, you know, because we were really quite desperate and we tried, but yeah, we couldn't find it. So it's a really big congratulations to you both for putting in all this work and for the whole team as well. And perhaps I can continue by just signaling some of the items on the chat. So JD Mittman says, for our information, the current triennial exhibition at the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne is presenting some contemporary kelp water carriers by Tasmanian artist Vicky West. And so he also gives a link, so you can explore that link. Then Polly Benz says, thank you both for your fantastic, that's to Stéphanie and Gaye. Thank you both for your fantastic presentations. What an amazing example of curatorial work, research, provenance, documentation trail, loss and rediscovery. And then also Polly Benz again, fascinating to learn about your research, Laetitia and Melissa.
And we have one further question. This is for Melissa from Alba Fernandez Gordons. Thank you to all the speakers. I have a question for Melissa. To what extent will you look at the materiality of the Hawaiian feathered cloaks / helmets?
Hi, yes, thanks Alba for the question. Yeah, I'm particularly interested at looking at these in detail because their construction is so interesting. The feather cloaks, for instance, there are so many kind of elements to them. There's the plant fiber cord that the kind of netting base is made from, and then there's all the feathers and how those are attached. So I'm quite interested at looking at those in detail, the ones that are in the NMS collection, and seeing the changes in construction over time. So as I mentioned in my presentation, there are a couple of examples in the collection that are likely from the late 18th century, and then one which is definitely from some time later. So just kind of comparing how they've been made and seeing if there's any visible changes over time in the way that they were constructed.
Great. Perhaps we might wrap up with first an opportunity for the speakers to ask each other questions. No? Okay, cool. Well, we're exactly on time, which is pretty fantastic. So I invite you all to join us again at 2:30 in Dutch time, so GMT +1 for people in England. And we'll see you then. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.